Welcome to Moments in Leadership, a podcast where you will hear firsthand about the careers of senior military leaders as they share their own unique and individual experiences. Moments in Leadership will immerse you in real-life stories where you will learn about the challenging situations these accomplished leaders faced and discover the lessons they learned early in their careers that were the most influential to developing their overall leadership style. And now, here's your host, retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel David B. Armstrong.
Welcome to Moments in Leadership. Today, my guest is retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General Bob Boomer Milstead, who served 40 years in the Marine Corps as an aviator flying the Cobra helicopter, but was also an ANGLICO Marine and a company commander at the basic school. In part one of a two-part interview, General Milstead and I spend some time talking about his career as an aviator, and we get into a great conversation about the difference between leading and managing and how those roles in the Marine Corps and in the military in general are different than in the civilian world. And it isn't until halfway through our careers as officers that we actually have to start to learn how to manage rather than lead. We also have a really interesting conversation that ties back into episode 2 with Matt Cooper, where we talk about how as we age and get older, our ability to assess leadership is different. And similar to what Matt says, it's tougher to recognize how good some leaders are until much further along in your life and your career. And stick around until the very end when General Milstead introduces the concept of the difference between something that is a sin and something that's a crime as a leader. So with no further ado, here's retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General Bob Boomer Milstead. General Milstead, welcome to Moments in Leadership. I really appreciate your willingness to come on and talk to us about your almost 40 years of experience in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, this will be fun. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. As you and I have discussed before, you are revered by many of my colleagues and friends in the Marine Corps, both in the aviation side and you have your ANGLICO experience. So I'm sure a lot of my listeners who are my ANGLICO brethren are going to be interested to hear some stories about the old ANGLICO and things like that. But you're quite the name because your time in the aviation community, and then also, and I know we'll get into this, but your time as a company commander at the basic school too. So you have definitely left an impression upon many of the second lieutenants. Some of them are my friends, and I've been excited about doing this interview for about a week and a half now. So I'm glad we're connecting. One of the really interesting things that you said to me when we started talking about doing this interview is that you have this philosophy that no one is really born a leader, and they're more or less born into an opportunity to lead. And you went on to tell me that you thought that your leadership skills from your younger days as a lieutenant were much different than your leadership skills from when you were a lieutenant colonel and a squadron commander. And then your leadership skills were much different as a MAG or Marine Air Group commander and so on. It fits so perfectly into what I'm trying to do with this project, which is convey these vignettes of leadership that people experience in the younger part of their careers, and then draw connections about those crystallizing moments that were so instrumental in developing your leadership style when you were a Marine Air Group commander, because there's no way you're a Marine Air Group commander without all of those experiences as a squadron commander and as a young lieutenant and captain in the aviation community. And I'm wondering if we could just really quickly hear a little bit about where your career took you, but jump into one of those leadership vignettes about how you became a leader in the Marine Corps.
I was more a follower, I think, in my college days, and I wasn't one of those guys that jumped right out at the front and follow me. I developed, I believe, as you pointed out, that leadership is as much caught as it is taught. And if you're fortunate to work for some people, you see some things. I've never worked for a leader that I never worked for somebody that I didn't learn something from. It may have been bad and tough lessons to be sure, but still lessons. So I do believe that nobody is born a leader. They may be born into an opportunity. They may be born with some seeds, but for me, it was developed. And I think it was probably maybe in ANGLICO, where I was a small unit leader, where I had to develop a relationship, with enlisted and depend on them and learned a lot. I think that may have been an area where I began to realize that hey, I enjoy this, and not that I have a knack for it, but that this leadership.
And for those of you that haven't heard any of the earlier podcasts, General Milstead and I share in common a unit that we both served in, not at the same time, referred to as ANGLICO, which is an acronym for Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company. And it's small teams that do exactly what it sounds like. They go out and they liaise on air and naval gunfire employment across the board. It's a pretty interesting community. But General Milstead, you were a pilot first, and you were a helicopter pilot and a Cobra.
Aviator.
I'm sorry. Exactly. You got to square us ground guys away. We get all
That's right.
The artillery guys were a stickler for terminology until it's somebody else's.
That's right. But I did. I to walk the dog very quickly. I was an OCS guy. I wasn't ROTC. I wasn't PLC. I was in a Navy program. I grew up in an Air Force family. My father was an Air Force pilot, so my whole life, I knew one thing. I wanted to fly. That was my polar star. I wanted to fly. So I'm in college. I'm in my senior year. I'm in a Navy program. I haven't done anything with the Navy yet. Probably 2 months from graduation. And I'm walking down the street in Houston, and I see one of those signs that's on the springs that kind of blows back and forth in the wind. And it says,
Sure.
The Marines are looking for a few good men to fly. And I go, well, I didn't know anything about the Marines. So I walked in. I'm office traffic. I walked in, and there's the OSO. And I talked to him. That night I called my dad and I said, I'm joining the Marine Corps.
Oh, he must have been thrilled.
Hey, well, now he is. So 6 months later, I show up at OCS at Quantico.
And so when you were in a Navy program, were you in a program that when you graduated from college, you were going to go to Navy OCS? Is that what you mean by that?
I was going to go to the AVROC program, which is kind of like, an officer and a gentleman, that kind of stuff. And I just, I always gravitated towards the Navy. And truth be told, the Air Force wasn't, they were riffing. This was 1974. They were not bringing people into the Air Force as pilots. They tell you, you come in as a navigator and one day we'll transition you, but that was bullshit. But and so I did OCS, and then bam, I think they gave us like 4 days off between OCS and right into TBS. Did 6 months of TBS, and I got a week and a half off, and I checked into Pensacola. And then I graduated from Pensacola 11 months to the day I checked in. 11 months. I flew 23 straight days one time.
Well, I think nowadays people wait 11 months just to start flight school after TBS. TBS is the basic school where all officers go who get commissioned as Marines, and we all go through a very common training. And then the aviators will go to flight school, and the artillery guys will go to, and that sort of thing. So normally now, sir, I think there's quite an extensive waiting period.
Oh yeah, guys won't check into the fleet until they're like captains. And being a Cobra guy, Cobras and Hueys, there was not a training squadron like the transports. So we went straight to our squadrons, and they were responsible to train us. So I checked into HMA 169 at Camp Pendleton as a second lieutenant. I got my first flight in a Cobra as a second lieutenant.
What was that, Vipers? Is that 169?
Yeah, it's the Vipers. But we didn't call ourselves the Vipers back then. But yeah, and 7 months later, I go on the first UDP, which is the Unit Deployment Program. They were looking at 6 month rotations instead of, not to get complicated, but instead of the 1 year tours. And so I go to Okinawa as a boot first lieutenant. So I did 2 tours in 169, and then I went to Anglico, which you explained. And then I came back and I was in the training squadron. By then they'd started a training squadron. So I did a training squadron for a while. And then I went off in command and staff. So I was a captain selected for major and headed off to command and staff college. And after that's when I went to the basic school, which turned out to be a great tour.
So that was after command and staff.
Yeah.
As a major.
As a young major.
Okay.
As a young major, I was in the command and leadership group for a year, and I taught some tactics, and then I was a company commander for Elvis Company, Company E and Alpha Company, Company A. That was a special time at the basic school. I mean, we had Jim Amos, who became the commandant, was a lieutenant colonel on the staff there. John Kelly, who another 4-star, was a friend of mine and was a major on the staff there. Louis Craparata.
Was it, there was also Colonel Kelly, who was the CO then too. Was that the same time you were there when Colonel
That was
Kelly?
Ed Kelly.
Ed Kelly. Yeah.
Ed Kelly took over from a guy named Terry Ebert. But Ed Kelly, Colonel Kelly was the CO. So we had Louis Craparata. He's still on active duty as a 3-star. Stacy Clarity's a 3-star. Jody Osterman just retired. He was a 3-star. And me, and just countless colonels that really made a name for themselves in the Corps. It was a special group of officers. It was a special time.
I'll bet. So then from there, after TBS, you were probably a mid-level major?
Yeah, I went to Mag 36 on Okinawa. I had to go back through refresher training, and that's when Saddam Hussein, invades Kuwait. And I'm like, whoa. I'm heading to Okinawa. There can't be a war without me. But there was. I tried to get my orders changed and tried to get into one of the gun squadrons that was heading over there. And the guy on Okinawa said, no. He's coming to us. Yeah, that was a very dark time.
I can imagine.
It formed some things that we can talk about later about how I brought my Marine aircraft group home from war, because I remembered what it was like to miss the fight. But so then I did Mag 36, and I took my family with me. It was a 1 year on a company tour, and I extended, and I took them. We lived out in town. Ended up having a daughter. Our youngest was born over there. Came back, went to 3rd Mall headquarters for about a year at a thing called the Ace Forward. Went to Somalia with them, and then got back into my home squadron, 169. And I was the XO, and then I fleeted up as the CO. And we could talk about that in a little while, because
that sounds interesting to go from XO to CO. Sure.
Yeah, that's a tough transition. But when I was at the wing headquarters before, that was the first time they did command screening. And we can talk about that. And I did not screen. I was a Lieutenant Colonel Select, so I was looked at, but there were all those guys, and they could only pick so many, and so I didn't screen. So I took that as failure. I'd never dealt with failure like that in my life. We can talk about that. That taught me a great deal. When you can empathize instead of sympathize with somebody that's gone through those sorts of things. But then I had a great time. I got to command 169, which is the squadron I was raised in. Then went to the National War College, was a student at the National War College, and then headed over to Headquarters Marine Corps in the Department of Aviation. That's an interesting time. We'll talk about that, because I was screened, but then the commandant then was General Krulak, and they pulled me off the command screen and said, no, you got to go joint, because you're not joint. So I said, well, I'm screwed, so I'll just stay in the building. And so I went to OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense. And then lo and behold, I screened for Mag 29 down at New River. Had never been to New River, never been stationed on the East Coast, aviation. And they'd never had a Cobra pilot command Mag 29. So you can imagine what they thought. Here comes a West Coast Cobra guy, and he's going to command. But it was another special group of people at a special time, and we went to war.
Right. And so a MAG is a Marine Air Group. For listeners who may not be a Marine, that's when things aren't squadrons anymore. That's when there are a lot of different squadrons under a Marine Air Group as the umbrella. So when you're a group commander, you're not only commanding the Cobras, but you're commanding transport helicopters and
jets. We had six or seven squadrons. We had 246 squadrons. We had 53 squadron. We had a 53 training squadron. We had a Cobra Huey squadron. Had the MALs, which is the maintenance guys. Had the headquarters squadron. And that's an interesting time too. And we can talk about that, because as a Cobra guy, last thing you need to do is spend an extra time down in the Cobra squadron. Can you imagine the poor guy that's the squadron commander?
No, it's like having a gunnery instructor as a battery commander.
So yeah, exactly. And then I thought I was done. So I said, hey, came back from war, if you want to call it a war, and then went over to 4th MEB and was going to finish up at 4th MEB. They came to me and they said, we're downsizing in Iraq and we need we want a colonel to take the wing forward over. And we want somebody with combat experience, and everybody agrees you're the guy. And I was like, no, I've done my 30. It's time for me to move on. So I changed my mind very quickly, went back and said, okay. Then I got selected for Brigadier General on my fourth look, which is worth talking about.
It sure is, because I think now it's 3 and...
Well, yeah, 2. But I was in a unique situation in that, the first couple times I've been looked at, I was still in the Pentagon because they had expanded the zones and everything. So I was selected for Brigadier General, came back and spent, a year and a half as the Director of Public Affairs in Headquarters Marine Corps.
Okay.
Then I got sent down to Quantico to command the Marine Corps Recruiting Command, probably next to leading Marines in combat, one of my most favorite times. And I didn't know anything about recruiting, which kind of worked out. And then General Amos became commandant, and he said he'd nominate me for my 3rd star and wanted me to be his manpower guy. And I did 4 years. He retired me, and then he retired like 2 weeks later. So I did 4 years as his manpower guy, and it ended up 40 years in the Marine Corps. Inconceivable to my Lance Corporals. They go, how long were you in the Marine Corps? Sir, you were in the Marine Corps before my father was born.
That's crazy. One of the things that makes speaking to you and my other guests is anybody who's served or anybody that's even worked in a civilian job, everybody can relate to being a first lieutenant, second lieutenant, or a lance corporal. Everybody can relate to, and I'll say for the other services, basically O1, 02, or E2, E3 kind of. Everybody can relate to that because everybody who serves in those ranks. Or if you're in a civilian world, entry-level worker in your 20s, everybody can relate to that. 100% everybody can relate to that. Only 1% of the people can relate to being a general officer or a sergeant major or the CEO of a big company. And people find that so fascinating. And so when you say you spent 40 years in the Marine Corps, I mean, that's serious time. As a 3-star general, the young folks like me like to say this about the generals like you, which is at that point, you're not in the system. You are the system. You're moving some heavy wood.
Yeah, you are. I'd have to pinch myself sometimes sitting at the big meetings where you'd be at the big wooden table and the commandants at one end, the assistant commandants at the other, 3 stars all around the table. And you're sitting there and you're like, what am I doing here?
Right.
Holy mackerel. So yeah, it is and it should be very humbling.
Well, I definitely want to hear more about that. I want to come back and I'm going to ask you a question because I want to ask you to relay what it was like the moment you got the call. I'm assuming you got a phone call. Hey, you've been selected for general. At this point, it would have been your 4th phone call, I think you said. Because I'm sure you get phone calls when you didn't get selected too.
No, well, yeah. Hey, Boomer, you're not on the list. I didn't expect it, so thank you, sir. But anybody that tells you that the first time that they got was the call from the commandant is blowing smoke up your skirt. Somebody is, you've gotten whispers, you've gotten some hints. I went home, I said to my wife, honey, I think I may have been selected for Brigadier General. But everybody does get a call, and they get the call. And for me, that was the period we had not yet deployed to Iraq. We were getting ready to go, and being a Cobra guy, I said, hey, I'm gonna fly. I was at Marine Corps Air Station New River, and I was getting my annual NATOPS check. That's where once a year you have to get your check ride, and they know that you can sign for your airplane and you're qualified. I just finished flying the NATOPS check. Squadron CO walks out to the flight line, and hey sir, Commandant's aide called, and Commandant wants to talk to you on the phone. He said they're going to call back in about 30 minutes, so why don't you just come up to my office and hang out in my office until the Commandant calls. I had a pretty good feeling that I knew what that what that meant. And so I sat up there with him, and when the commandant called, he walked out of the office, and his General Hagee was the commandant. And he says, you probably already know this, but I just want to call you and tell you personally, you've been selected for promotion to Brigadier General. Talked to him just briefly, and then called my wife and said, honey, guess what?
It's crazy because you probably remember this twice, but there were those moments at TBS when you were a second lieutenant, and there were moments when you were there as a major, as a company commander. And at some point you either said to a group of lieutenants, or somebody came in and said to the group of lieutenants, somebody in this room is going to be a general. The general will say, like, I'd give anything to be back in your shoes. What's really interesting is that you can actually relate to that because you became a general. And you know what those lieutenants were going through at TBS because you were a company commander. And then you know what they were going through because you were there too.
I never thought I'd go 40 years. I never, you eat that elephant one bite at a time, and it was, I'd come home and tell my wife, I go, hey, my contract's up. We can get out. She said, well, you're having fun, aren't you? And we're enjoying this. Yeah. Okay. And that happened. And then you get promoted to major, and that has a little bit more, you got to hang around a little bit longer. And then you go to school, that has a tail to it. And the next thing you know, I could actually be a squadron commander.
Right.
So, you a little bit, and a little bit, and you keep going. But I was never, one of those guys that was like, oh yeah, that's me. That was, no.
If you rewind back to that time as a late second lieutenant, first lieutenant, and you're checking into 169 and there was no formal training for the aircraft, you said the squadron was responsible for, and I can't remember, we used to call it the RAG, but...
Yeah, there was a syllabus. It was formal. There was no RAG, but it was, there was a formal syllabus. You had to get X number of X's, and I was miserable.
Maybe you can tell us a couple of stories about those times when you're checking into a squadron, some of the things you learned. I've got to imagine in the aviation community, there are some moments of fear, I think, probably, that all aviators experience. And some of those early experiences flying and learning to fly must have been crystallizing for you in your leadership style at some point.
The things that I remember are things like, I'm brand new. I'm a second lieutenant. Okay, so I'm calling first lieutenants sir, and they're like, stop that. I remember I had a 1976 Cutlass Salon. Oh, what a set of wheels that I bought in Pensacola, So I go whipping it. Well, there's a parking spot right up towards the front. So I just go whipping into the parking spot and go in there. And the captains in this squadron at this time, most of them had Vietnam time, but they were still captains. So they're a crusty bunch. And here I am, a second lieutenant. And I won't say his name, but this guy walks into the ready room, and I'm sitting there, and he goes, who the F's Cutlass is parked down there and I'm like, well, that's mine, sir. And he goes, tosses me his keys. He's got a vet. He goes, that's my parking spot. Move your effing car and put my car in that and bring the keys back here. And I've never forgot that. What a dumbass of me. Hey, there's an empty spot. So I did. I moved the cars in there. And the XO of that squadron, I think he's dead now, so I can say this, but oh boy, he just took to me. I was miserable. I'd sit in the BOQ, and of course we didn't have cell phones, any of that stuff. And so, I get to talk to my girlfriend, now my wife, commiserate. I was miserable. But, I learned a lot. And there were some great characters in there. Again, these guys taught me a lot. They taught me a lot.
I think one of the things that makes the aviation community fascinating to the ground people is the difference in leadership in terms of your responsibility in that aircraft is learning to fly it safely and becoming a great pilot. You're learning from others about I'll call it a technical skill of flying an aircraft. And on the ground side, we were learning about our technical skills and things like that by looking to emulate others. Did you find yourself in that period of your career trying to emulate leadership styles of other aviators that you were flying with?
I think so. I think you always do that. I mean, I think that starts from the very first. Your SPC, your staff platoon commander, that captain or that first lieutenant that was responsible for you at the basic school. Remember him? You kind of watched him and you took the things that he did. Our guy's name was Dick Lewis, and I remember one time, for some reason, he was wearing a rubber band on his wrist, and he had it on for a couple of days. By the end of the week, half the platoon had rubber bands on their wrist. I mean, that's my joke, but it's true. So, it's examples. It's leadership by example, and it's the same thing. You learn the skills, and I was very blessed to as I came up in that squadron to work around and fly with some guys that were very experienced. And so, did I copy? Yeah. Plagiarism is the greatest form of flattery. You bet.
And I think the thing that's really interesting is, so for listeners, General Milstead was a Cobra pilot, and Cobras are front seat, back seat, not side by side. So, and I'm assuming that as you're learning to fly. So if I think back to when I was a first lieutenant or a captain, I am observing the behavior of 40 to 150 people all at once. Either it's a platoon or a company or anything like that. You're in an aircraft with one person, and you're trying to learn that skill from one person without being able to see them all that well, especially if you're sitting in the front seat. And maybe you could talk about how you learned to lead in the aviation community and become a technically proficient aviator in an environment where it's probably a lot harder to see and emulate people's skill set in an aircraft relative to, say, a ground officer who can watch his company commander issue a brief and things like that. It must be a completely different environment to try to learn.
You learn how to fly. They'll talk to you. Hey, watch your nose attitude. Bring your nose up here. Push it over this. They'll talk you through maneuvers and stuff like that. But you also had a regular job. You had a job on the ground. You're working in ops. You're working in maintenance. Everybody wanted to get in maintenance because that way they would have enlisted Marines, around them. So you had other jobs. So you learned your leadership, how to work with enlisted Marines and things like that. Because remember, we had not done that. I'd been at the officer candidate school. I'd gone to flight school, and then I'd gone to the basic school, and then I'd gone to flight school, and now I checked in. So I'd never had a lance corporal or sergeants around me. And for me, I was very fortunate. Again, I said I grew up in an Air Force family. My dad was an Air Force officer. He was a pilot, and he was one of my mentors. My dad taught me a lot. And one of the things he told me when you go off, he called them non-coms. That's what the Air Force called them, non-commissioned officers. He said, listen to them. Listen to them, and they'll teach you. Worst thing you can do is go in there and start acting like you're in charge, because you may be senior to them in rank, but you don't know, poop from smokehouse ham. So I ended up working in quality assurance, which is probably the top ends places in maintenance. And I did that. I joke around and say, my first boss was a gunny. I worked for Gunny Goodfowl, was his name, Bert Goodfowl. But I told him right up front, listen, I don't know shit. You're going to have to, help me. And he grabbed it. He liked that.
What were some of the tough lessons you learned at 169?
Keep your mouth shut, Just keep your mouth shut. If you don't know something, keep your mouth shut. But tough lessons, we would get wirebrush regularly. The low-end lieutenants, they called us PUIs, pilots under instruction, PUIs. And they would spit it out like it was a subhuman life form. That affected, when I was a squadron commander and, later in my career, how I would treat the new guys. As we call them in the Marine Corps, the FNGs, right?
So from 169, you went over to ANGLICO. And what I found really interesting about your time at ANGLICO, the first thing that jumped out to me was that you were at 2nd ANGLICO. But 2nd ANGLICO was at Camp Pendleton. As listeners may or may not know now, there's 6 ANGLICOs now. But 1st ANGLICO is at Camp Pendleton, and 2nd ANGLICO is at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, or Camp Lejeune, depending on what your generation is.
They had put 1st ANGLICO in a cadre status. So they called a separate brigade platoon 2nd ANGLICO. We could only do a single regiment or a single brigade Whereas, the East Coast and now the guys on the West Coast, they can do the full Monte. So it was a smaller unit. It was a separate brigade platoon, 2nd Anglico. But we were the same building that you were in, right there, looking Delmar, swingland trainer right next to us. And that was, I think, that's where the transformation began. And it was a great tour. I went through jump school, and then I went through Pathfinder school too when I was there. Spent 2 years in Anglico.
It's such a great unit. And the building that you talk about, if any of the listeners are also following my Instagram page, I have a picture, sir, of the Anglico CP. At some point, and maybe it was when you were there, they painted the word Anglico on the roof so you could see it from an airplane. And there's a picture of us conducting a spy rigging operation, so you can see the Marines swinging out underneath the belly of a Huey over the CP, 6 guys hanging off of it, and the Anglico on the roof of the old building. It's a fantastic picture. I'll make sure that you see it. So you came into Anglico as an aviator off of a UDP to Okinawa. So you had spent some time flying.
Well, I'd been on the boat too. I did 2 tours in 169. So I was promoted to captain the 2nd tour, and we were on the boat. We were on the old USS Tripoli, LPH-10. You may have shaved with it this morning.
Well, as a matter of fact, my last MEU deployment was the command ship was the USS New Orleans, which was LPH. I don't even remember. No well deck, right? Old.
Yeah, same thing. Same as the. So I'd done that, came back, and then went to Anglico.
When you checked, you said it was a smaller unit than what it is now. Were there other aviators there with you? Did you come with new aviators?
Most of the officers were either artillery officers. There were two Navy officers, one of which is still remains a very close friend of mine. And then there was the CO was an infantry officer. He was one of my mentors, a guy named Paul Pugh. Ended up at Villanova, just retired colonel, just a stellar officer. I learned a great deal from him. He was the CO. His XO was an aviator. The S1 was an aviator. I was the S3. I was an aviator. The S4 was an aviator. They were pretty much aviators. There were some artillery guys. The arty guys were first lieutenants. There was an ensign and a lieutenant, JG, because we focused on artillery and naval gunfire and air-delivered ordnance.
What do you remember about some of your leadership lessons that you learned as you were transitioning out of being an aviator and now essentially being a ground officer and leading Marines in a ground role?
That's where I really began to learn that you can't do everything. You got to delegate. You're ultimately responsible, but you got to delegate. You got to trust people. And so that's kind of where I developed what I call my dad principle. Delegate and disappear. And then I smile, but you're ultimately accountable. But you got to let people do stuff. And they may not do it the way exactly you do it, but you got to let them do it. And you can't do everything.
We talk about delegation as a leadership skill routinely in the Marines, and we talk about how important it is. But I personally find it to be one of the hardest things for people to actually embrace and do. And I'm wondering if you can share some moments about your successes there, or...
Well, I think the Marine Corps is better at it today than it was. I mean, those are mission orders, right? Mission orders. To me, the exemplar of a mission order is when they look at Chamberlain and they say, "You are the left flank of the Union line. You must hold this ground at all cost." They didn't tell him to anchor on the boulder and refuse his left flank and turn it around. They just said, "You are the left flank of the Union line. You will hold this ground at all costs." And the guy rode away. So that's mission orders.
It's an interesting concept, too, that translates really well over into regular, everyday civilian leadership, too. I love your term, delegate and disappear. It's such a great way to remember the importance of not only delegating, but then disappearing. Because if you delegate and just stand there and watch, you're just a micromanager at that point, right?
That's right. And it applies to the corporate world as much as to the military world.
It absolutely does. And I find that one of the interesting things when I look at people who serve in the military, Marines specifically, and some of my civilian friends, is that while we may not think that we're ever great at delegating in the military, it's part of our DNA. And that's something that on the civilian side, people really don't have a huge opportunity to grow up learning until they're in a position, and it doesn't come very naturally to them. It's the unwritten leadership trait or principle that could definitely transcend military service to civilian leadership.
We're just control freaks. And so they call it micromanagement. Can you imagine trying to be a division commander or a wing commander or even an air group commander? I can remember as a lieutenant, you talked about checking in the squadron, looking at the CO and thinking, God, he's so old looking. And how does he know everything that's going on in this squadron? Well, he doesn't. So you can now imagine, take that up many more levels to where you're a Marine aircraft group commander and you've got 7 squadrons. Do you know everything that's going on? No. But do you know who your squadron commanders are and you trust them and you've given them a mission to do, and then you let them do it?
Right, exactly. And of course, you're ultimately responsible for everything that your people do or fail to do.
Exactly.
And maybe we could do a better job of this in the Marine Corps or in any of the services, is we all grew up, and maybe they don't do this anymore, but I know you and I grew up with, when you're going through boot camp or officer candidate school, whatever it is, there's only 3 responses: yes or no, sir, and the candidate will find out, sir. I mean, right? That's kind of the joke. Boy, at some point, as a leader, I think the answer of "I don't know" is probably one of the best answers you could give if you're truly delegating things to people. It doesn't mean you'll never know. I think there are, especially as you get up in rank or get up in responsibility in a civilian world, where if you're properly delegating things to people that you trust, and somebody says, what's going on with XYZ, and you say, I don't know, that is not an indication of somebody who is not in charge, and it's, I don't know because the person I delegated to hasn't finished it yet, and as soon as they're done, I'll find out. It's an honest answer.
It's an honest answer. I can recall vividly as a 3-star sitting there having a staff meeting, and I wasn't one for meetings, and a meeting had to be done in like 30 minutes. But I can remember asking a guy a question, and he said, "I don't know, sir." And I said, "That is a great answer." And he says, "But I'm going to find out, and I'll come back to you." And I go, "Perfect, thank you." Instead of trying to bullshit me with, because if you say I don't know, too often in our business or in the corporate world or whatever, it's viewed as, an admission of incompetency or I don't know, I should know. And it's as a weakness. No, admit you don't know it. It's a strength.
And nowhere in our leadership traits and principles do you find anything that says like, "Hey, it's okay to not know what's going on." I mean, it's almost counterculture to us as Marines. Like, "Oh, geez, I don't know." At what point in your career, because you said I was leading a meeting as a 3-star, if you had to rewind back in your career, at what point was it that you realized that it was okay to have a subordinate not know the answer to a question that you had? It probably wasn't as a first and second lieutenant, right, sir? I mean, you had to have developed that.
Maybe a senior captain. The transition between, and that's something we should talk about, the transition between being a captain and a major is significant. That's the transition to management. I can recall vividly the Marine Air Group. I was on the Marine Air Group staff for a while. I was the weapons and tactics instructor, and I worked in the operations thing. And I was a captain, and I was promoted to major. And the executive officer, he said, "You were one of the best captains I've ever served with. But as a field grade officer, you are effed up. You are, because as a captain, you went through the wall. You made things happen. But as a major, and I hated myself as a major. That's the worst rank I ever had. I'm sorry, I'll say it now. But I hated it. You had to do things differently.
So I had an unusual career as major because I was in the reserve. So my major time isn't traditional relative to a major time that somebody sees on active duty. But I do know exactly what you're saying. There's a completely different set of expectations, and your leadership style does have to change at that point, because it's the first time in your military career that you start to introduce the term management into your career. Because up until that point, you are a leader, you're leading. it's leadership. And then it becomes about management. And what's interesting in the civilian world is those two things are completely inverted. Most people start out managing something, and then they are promoted up into leadership positions.
And unfortunately, oftentimes they're synonymous. They view them as synonymous, whereas, you manage things, you lead people. But all too often, and you nailed it, where, there are people that think, managing and leading are the same thing, and you don't. They're not. No, I had a squadron commander. He was a phenomenal manager. He was a terrible leader. You can't be a good leader without being a good manager, but you can be a good manager without being a good leader.
We all come across them in our careers, people who are great managers and never really inspire the men that they're leading, men and women that they're leading. And that happens, and you're right. And it's not that there's not a place for them. It's just that they're probably not going to become a general officer.
Or they may.
Assume. But I suppose. I wouldn't know. I was lucky to become a lieutenant colonel. So I just think that that's a really interesting point to punctuate, because as people are listening to this podcast and are trying to glean some insight into leadership from somebody who ascended all the way to the 3-star rank and spent 40 years in the Marine Corps, people who are listening are trying to suss out some sort of nuggets that they can apply to their own life. And I think you just hit on two of them, that it's okay to say, I don't know. And as a leader, it should be okay to accept that as an answer, a temporary answer. And the huge difference between management and leadership, because I think those two things are much more understood as being different in the military. I don't think that they are understood as being two different things in the civilian world. So maybe some of the people who are listening that are civilians, that's one thing that they could assess in their own, as they're developing their own leadership styles, is, are you working on your management skills or are you working on your leadership skills? Because they're mutually exclusive.
Yes. The boundary between them sometimes is porous, but they are distinctly different.
Right. They can be as thin as a millimeter wide, but as thick as the Grand Canyon sometimes too. And I also think one of the things I hear from my peers a lot, there's as much to learn from a bad leader as there is a good leader. It's just one experience is a lot more enjoyable than the other.
Oh, hell yes. And you watched people and you went, I like that. And so you put that in your card catalog, or your Outlook file today. And then when you see something that obviously, oh my God, I can't believe he did that. Then you put that aside. Absolutely. Like I said, I think earlier, I've never worked for somebody that I didn't learn something from. It may have been a negative lesson, but it was a lesson nonetheless.
So my first guest was retired Colonel Matt Cooper, who was an artillery officer and a really good friend of mine. And he tells a riveting story about his time when he was in the Oklahoma City building when it blew up and some of the leadership lessons he took out of that. But he goes on to tell a story about how his next time in an artillery battalion, he worked for a horrible battalion commander. And he thought, geez, it just can't get any worse than this, until the next guy came in and he was even worse. And Matt tells a story, and for anybody listening to this, go back to episode 1 and you can listen to the story about halfway through our 2-hour chat. And he talks about how awful the experience was and some of the things that his battalion commander did that set such horrible examples for people, and how he learned so much from that in a way that it's the opposite of trying to emulate somebody. And I'm wondering if you have any similar experiences like that in your career that you could, share a vignette on.
I have one squadron commander and did a couple of things that were questionable at best. But on that, I think it's important also to say that depends where you are. I can remember, for instance, I was a first lieutenant. We had a squadron commander, and he ended up being relieved. I can't believe that they've relieved this guy. And as I grew older and more experienced and developed, I can see exactly why they relieved him. And if I would have been the wing commander, I probably would have too. I can think of other instances where I questioned, decisions by leaders and went, that's not the way to do things. But then as you get older and more experienced, you can look back and go, that guy wasn't as screwed up as I thought he was at that point. So I think that's important to bring up, that, the view depends on where you're sitting, if you're following what I'm saying.
The episode before this with you, I interviewed retired Major General Milstead, who I'm pretty sure you know personally. And Mel tells a story. He tells a few stories, and then his observation about leadership is this. And I'm boiling it down. I may get it a little bit wrong, but he made the point that it's never the event that gets somebody relieved. It's always the person's behavior that is assessed in the context of the event that gets them relieved.
I think that's probably 90%, correct. I mean, there are times when it's what the guy did, certainly.
Yeah, I think his point was also in the context of second chances also, in that if there's an event and it wasn't malicious and you're a good person, and there are times that people get second chances. And that's
something that we should stress, because that is across all boundaries, corporate world. There is a difference between a sin and a crime, a big difference, and you should view them differently. What's wrong with giving a guy a second chance? We in the Marine Corps, have a reputation of not being very, generous with second chances. But I think that's a bad rap. I think that we all get second chances. I know I made it as far as I did because I was given some second chances. And anybody that makes it 40 years and gets a third star and doesn't think that they were ever, given a second chance, I feel sorry for them.
Are you willing to share a story about a second chance that you got?
Oh, I've gotten second chance. Good grief. I mean, they're just, not to go open kimono, but there's plenty of second chances. I mean, I've porked the poodle a couple of times. I mean, who hasn't? I mean, I've made the wrong decisions. I talked to a group of young officers once, and they asked me, they said, what are some of your mistakes? And I said, without being specific, I think some of the things that I regret the most would be times that I didn't do something that I should have done something, instead of times that I did something that I shouldn't have done something. Inaction. I should have spoke up. I should have done something. Those are the times I think that in the privacy of my own reflections, I go, I should have done something there. But second chances, I mean, I'd have to sit back and think, but there's no too few of them. Believe me.
It's funny that you say that about inaction. In my first podcast, I shared a quick story where I thought there was a flash, and you and I will have to compare notes. We may have been in Somalia at the same time, but I share a story about when I was attached to 17 and I was an artillery officer with a Prick 113, which is a radio that can talk to airplanes, exclusively to talk to airplanes. It's rare for anybody who's not a forward air controller to have that radio. I did. There was a moment where I thought my indecisiveness was going to cost the lives of Marines because I didn't clear an aircraft hot on an engagement. And I thought that my indecisiveness on that was going to result in Marine deaths on a raid. Turns out my indecisiveness was actually the right decision because I was unsure of the target. Turns out that it would have been a target full of civilians. So I know what you mean about that looking back on things and saying like, geez, I wonder, well, my story is exactly the opposite of yours, but there are those moments of indecisiveness that are regrettable. And then there's those moments of indecisiveness that are regrettable and irregrettable, just like I guess decisions can be, right? You can have those as well. But no, I think the second chance thing is really interesting too, because, and we're coming up on an hour, so we may have to get into this in our next part, but we'll conclude this part with this conversation about second chances. And I'd love to pick up on our next part of this, the second hour, where maybe we can start off by talking about second chances again, because I think that there is an interesting conversation to be had about how much are we squashing people's initiatives in actually taking risk Are we creating leaders who are risk averse in the interest of their careers and at the expense of good training that could actually translate into saving lives in future conflicts? Sir, thank you. This first hour has been fantastic. I look forward to us picking up on part 2. Bob Boomer Milstead have talked about some great things about leadership and how it can transcend into the civilian community as well. And in the next hour, we will pick up on some more leadership traits and principles. And great. Well, thank you so much for your time, sir, and look forward to part 2. Thanks for listening to Moments in Leadership. Whether you're a first-time listener or you've been following along from the start, I'd really like to know what you think about the show and, of course, any suggestions that you have for improvements. But here's how you can help me keep this project going. If you could please subscribe, leave a 5-star review if you think it's worthy, and leave a very quick review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. The reviews and the subscription and the 5 stars make it easier for others to find the show and really helps me out a lot. Finally, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook under Moments in Leadership, or you can email me at the Mill Office, that's the MILOFFICE @gmail.com. So the Mill Office @gmail.com with any suggestions or even ideas for future guests. I really appreciate your support in this project.